Пустим трансляцию и будем надеяться, что все
Погоди, нет,
работает.
это фигня какая-то. Здесь есть официальное алло на ютубе?
Не знаю.
Я тебя не могу найти. Ты можешь? Ну-ка, на канале Sony есть она? Нет, конечно. Play
А ты время-то
5.
точное?
Да сейчас 7, да. Да ну, алло, можно без даунов?
О, у Симона новый видос.
Да?
Мгм.
Можем это с переводом посмотреть.
Кого?
Да?
Мгм.
Презентацию, но просто на ютубе нигде нет нормальной.
Нет, ты чё, никаких переводов.
Если найдешь без даунов, скажи. Я не нашел. Вот реально не смог найти. Дань, ты нашел? Нет?
Я и не искал пока.
Ну, блядь, я так и думал. Конечно же, ты не искал. Как обычно.
Так, ну вроде все настроил. Вроде все даже работает.
Если даже PlayStation даже не стримит, что за дерьмо? Откуда вообще типа этот транс... А, стоп. Ха-ха.
А где?
Я себе кинул ссылку.
Она работает?
Сейчас.
Ай.
Developers were already banging up against the limits of the hard drive, and a lot of developer time was being spent designing around slow load speeds.
Прикольно.
Unfortunately, though, it's highly likely that your data is scattered around in various files on the hard drive,
Вот так.
as well as sourced from multiple locations within those files.
Так.
So lots of seeks are needed at 2 to 50-ish milliseconds each. My rule of thumb is that the hard drive is spending 2/3 of its time seeking, and only 1/3 of its time actually loading data. Putting all of that together, a gigabyte is very roughly 20
Привели
seconds
пример,
to
типа.
load from a hard drive.
Вот так у нас было, вот так у
Now,
нас
a
стало.
gigabyte is
Да,
not
было
much
бы
time.
лучше,
Games are
согласен.
using 5 or 6 gigabytes of RAM on PlayStation 4, so boot times and load times can get pretty grim. Or to put that differently, as a player, you wait for the game to boot, wait for the game to load, wait for the level to reload every time you die, and you wait for what is euphemistically called fast travel. And all of that leads to the dream. What if we could have not just an SSD, but a blindingly fast SSD? If we could load 5 gigabytes a second from it, what would change? Now, SSDs are completely different from hard drives. They don't have seeks as such. If you have a 5 gigabyte a second SSD, you can read data from 1,000 different locations in that second, pretty much at speed.
Ебать.
As for time to load a gigabyte, this is next gen we're talking about, so memory is bigger. Instead, we should be asking how long to
Гигабит в
load 2
секунду.
gigabytes. And the answer is about a quarter of a second. I mean, that's amazing. We're talking 2 orders of magnitude, meaning very roughly
Подожди.
100 times faster.
Что?
Which means at 5 gigabytes a second for the SSD, the potential is
5
that the game
гигабайт
boots
или
in a second.
гигабит?
There are no load screens. The game just fades
Гигабайт.
down while loading
Ты
half a
видел?
dozen gigabytes and fades back up again.
Там,
Same for
короче,
load.
раньше
You're
загрузка была
immediately
1
back in
гигабайт
action
20
and
секунд,
die. And
а
fast
стало
travel becomes so fast
2
like a
гигабайта в
missile. As
0,27
game creators,
секунд.
we go from trying to
Как
distract
это
the player
работает?
from how long fast travel is taking, like those
Пиздец.
Spider-Man subway rides, to being so blindingly fast
Так
we
вообще
might even
возможно?
have to slow that transition down. Pretty cool,
Как
right?
видишь.
But
Ну,
for
сейчас,
me, this is
если нам
not the
покажут,
primary reason to change
не
the
только на
load
словах,
of an SSD. The
будет клево.
primary reason for an ultra-fast SSD is that it gives the game designer freedom. Or to put that differently, with a hard drive, the 20 seconds that it takes to load a gigabyte can sabotage the game that the developer is trying to create. I think almost all of us in the room have experienced this, maybe in different ways. Say we're making an adventure game and we have 2 rich environments where we each want enough textures and models to fill memory, which you can do as long as you have a long staircase or elevator ride or a windy corridor where you can ditch the old assets and then take 30 seconds or so to load the new assets. Having a 30-second elevator ride is a little extreme. More realistically, we'd probably chop the world into a number of smaller pieces and then do some calculations with sight lines and run speeds like we did for Haven City when we were making Jack 2. The game is 20 years old, but not much has changed since then. All those twisty passages are there for a reason. There's a whole subset of level design dedicated to this sort of work, but still, it's a giant distraction for a team that just wants to make their game. So when I talked about the dream of an SSD, part of the reason for that 5 gigabyte a second target was to eliminate loads, but also part of the reason for that target was streaming. As in, what if the SSD is so fast that as the player is turning around, it's possible to load textures for everything behind the player in that split second? If you figure that it takes half a second to turn, that's 4 gigabytes of compressed data you can load. That sounds about
Такое
right
вроде
for
бы GTA
next gen.
было.
Anyway, back to the hard drive. Another strategy for increasing effective read speed is to make big sequential chunks of data. For example, we might group all the data together for each city block. That removes most of the seeks, and the streaming gets faster. But there's a downside too, which is that frequently used data is included in many chunks and therefore is on the hard drive many times. Marvel's Spider-Man uses this strategy,
А он
and it works
фиолетовым
very
был?
well for increasing the
Нет.
streaming speed.
Ну,
There's a
плюс-минус.
massive duplication as a result. Some of the objects like mailboxes or news racks are on the hard drive 400 times. What I'm describing here are things that cramp a creative director's style. Either level design gets a little bit boring in places, or the data is duplicated so many times that it no longer fits on the Blu-ray disc. And you end up with hard limits on the player's run speed or driving speed. The player can't go faster than the load speed from the hard drive. And finally, I'm sure many of you have noticed that after a patch download, a PlayStation 4 will sometimes take a long time to install the patch. That's because when just part of a file has been changed, the new data can be downloaded pretty quickly. But before the game boots up, a brand new file has to be constructed that includes the changed portion. Otherwise, every change would add a seek or 2. Even so, you can occasionally see this happening on game titles. They start to hitch once they get patched enough. With an SSD, though, no seeks, so no need to make brand new files with the changes incorporated into them, which means no installs as you know them today. There's yet one more benefit, which is that system memory can be used much more efficiently. On PlayStation 4, game data on the hard drive feels very distant and difficult to use. By the time you realize you need a piece of data, it's much too late to go out and load it. So system memory has to contain all of the data that could be used in the next 30 seconds or so of gameplay. That means a lot of the 8 gigabytes of system memory is idle. It's just waiting there to be potentially used. On PlayStation 5, though, the SSD is very close to being like more RAM. Typically, it's fast enough that when you realize you need a
Ебать,
piece of
нихуя
data,
себе.
you can just load it from the
А
SSD and use
DR6
it.
вообще
There's
сейчас есть
no need to
видеокарта?
have lots of data parked in system memory waiting
Не
to
знаю.
potentially be used. A different
Потом
way of
зайдем
saying that
посмотрим.
is that most of RAM is working on the game's
Мне кажется,
processor.
таких
This is one of the
такой
reasons that
памяти
16
еще нету.
gigabytes of GDDR6 feels right for PlayStation 5. The presence of the SSD reduces the need for a massive intergenerational increase in size. So back to the dream of the SSD. Here's the set of targets. Boot the game in a second. No load screens. Design freedom, meaning no twisty passages or long corridors. More game on the disk and more game on the SSD. And finally, those patch installs go away. The reality, though, is that the SSD is just one piece of the puzzle. There's a lot of places where bottlenecks can occur in between the SSD and the game code that uses the data. You can see this on PlayStation 4. If I use an SSD with 10 times the speed of a standard hard drive,
Нихуя
I
себе.
probably see only double the loading speed, if that. For PlayStation 5, our goal was not just that the SSD itself be 100 times faster. It was that game loads and streaming would be 100 times faster. So every single potential bottleneck needed to be addressed. And there are a lot of them.
Что?
Let's look at check-in and what happens when its overhead gets 100 times larger. Conceptually, check-in is a pretty simple process. Data is loaded into system memory from the hard drive or SSD. It's examined. A few values are tweaked to check it in, and then it's moved to its final location. At the SSD speeds we're talking about, that last part, moving the data, meaning copying it from one location to another, takes roughly an entire next-gen
Она мне
CPU.
покажет дизайн?
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. If all the overheads get 100
Не,
times
сейчас я
larger,
думаю.
that will cripple the frame rate
Сейчас они
as soon
сначала
as the player
повыебываются,
moves,
насколько
and
я
that
охуенный.
massive stream of data
Да
starts
это
to flow
пиздец.
to the SSD. So to solve all of that, we built
У
a
них SSD
lot
в 100
of
раз
custom
быстрее,
hardware,
чем
namely
HDD.
a custom flash
Вау.
controller and a number of custom units in our main chip. The flash controller in the SSD was designed for
Или они
smooth and
создали типа
bottleneck-free operation,
умный
but also
SSD-шник.
with games in
Я
mind.
так и не
For
понял.
example, there are 6 levels of priority when reading from the SSD. Priority is very important. You can imagine the player heading into some new location in the world and the game requesting a few gigabytes of textures. And while those textures are being loaded, an enemy is shot and has to speak a
Не
few
трогай.
dying words.
Блин.
Having multiple priority levels
Это
lets
не
the
укулеле.
audio for those dying words get loaded immediately.
Ты взял
On
разбитую
one
гитару,
side, that
а?
flash controller connects to
Нет.
actual flash dies that supply the storage. To reach our
А
bandwidth
откуда?
target of 5 gigabytes
Я
a
же тебе
second, we
объяснял,
ended
что
up
это
with a
такое.
12-channel interface. 8 channels wouldn't be enough. The
Не
resulting bandwidth we've achieved is
Пружина
actually
на
5.5
пантографе.
gigabytes
А,
a second.
точно.
With a 12-channel interface, the most natural size that emerges for an SSD is 825 gigabytes. The key question for us was, is that enough? I mean, it's tempting to add more, but Flash certainly doesn't come cheap, and we have a responsibility to our gaming audience to be cost-effective with regards to what we put in the console. Ultimately, we resolved this question by looking at the play patterns of a broad range of gamers. We examined the specific games that they were playing over the course of a weekend or a week or a month, and whether that set of games would fit properly on the SSD. We were able to establish that the friction caused by reinstall or re-download and so we locked in on that 825 gigabyte size, while also preparing multiple strategies so that those who want more storage can add. I'll go through the details in a moment.
Тут
Back to the
details,
flash controller.
блядь, а ты
On the other
шуршишь.
side, it connects to our main custom chip via 4 lanes of Gen 4 PCIe. And inside the main custom chip is a pretty hefty unit dedicated to I/O. Before we talk about what that does, let's talk compression for a moment. PlayStation 4 used zlib as its compression format. We decided to use it again on PlayStation 5, but on my 2017 tour of developers, I learned about a new format called Kraken from Rad Game Tools. It's like zlib's smarter cousin. Simple, similar types of algorithms, but about 10% better compression, which is pretty big. That means 10% more game on the UHD Blu-ray disc or on the SSD.
Свинота.
Kraken had only been out for a year, but it was
Свинота.
already becoming a de facto
Это,
industry
заходи,
standard.
там
Half the
PlayStation.
teams I talked to were either using it or getting ready to evaluate it. So we hustled and built a custom decompressor into the I/O unit, one capable of handling over 5
Кстати, а как
gigabytes.
вы относитесь к фразе «все консольщики долбоебы»?
Тихо, я не слышу.
Как долбоёбом.
22 gigabytes a second if the data happened to compress particularly well. By the way, in terms of performance, that custom decompressor equates to 9 of our Zen 2 cores. That's what it would take to decompress the Kraken stream of a conventional CPU. There's a lot
Прикинь, не
more
будет-
in a custom
Господи,
IO
про
unit,
SSD-шник
including a
расскажи,
dedicated
пожалуйста.
DMA controller. The game
Артём,
can
не
direct
будет этих
exactly where
лотскринов.
it wants to send the data coming off of the SSD.
Чё?
This
Не
equates
будет
to
лотскринов.
another Zen 2 core
Кого?
or 2 in terms of
Загрузочных экранов.
its primary purpose is to remove
Ну, у нас
check-in as a
Englishman.
whole.
Мне очень интересно, можно типа
There's
про
two
консоль рассказать, а не
dedicated
про
I/O
SSD-шник?
coprocessors and a large RAM pool. These aren't Zen 2 cores. They're there principally to direct the variety of custom hardware around them. One of the coprocessors is dedicated to SSD I/O. This lets us bypass traditional file I/O and its bottlenecks when reading from the SSD. The other is responsible for memory mapping, which I know doesn't sound like anything related to the SSD, but a lot of developers map and remap memory as part of file I/O, and this too can become a bottleneck. There are coherency engines to assist the
bottleneck.
coprocessors. Coherency comes up a lot in places. Probably the biggest coherency issue is stale data in the GPU caches. Flushing all of the GPU caches whenever the SSD is read is an unattractive option. It could really hurt the GPU performance. So we've implemented a gentler way of
А что, её
doing
показали, нет?
where
Нет.
coherency
Её
engines
показали?
inform the GPU
Пока
of
нет.
the overwritten address ranges, and custom scrubbers in several dozen GPU caches do pinpoint evictions of just those address ranges. The best thing is, as a game developer, when you read from the SSD, you don't need to know any of this. You don't even need to know that your data is compressed. You just indicate what data you'd like to read from your original
Блин, он бы
uncompressed
хотя бы
file,
причесался.
and where you'd like to
Класс.
put it. And the whole process
Он такой,
of
типа, ну
loading
это
it
вам всё знать, типа,
happens
вообще не
invisibly
важно.
to you in very
Вообще. Зачем я это
Back to the
рассказывал,
dream.
я не понимаю
Thanks
сам.
to all of that surrounding
Смотрите, вот у меня
hardware,
очки,
our
короче, там я надену,
5.5
значит,
gigabytes a
расскажу,
second
что
really
будет.
should
Артём,
translate
посмотри
to
вот на
like
циферку.
100 times faster I/O
Смотрите,
FPS
5
and allow the
гигабайт. Что это
dream
значит,
of
я не
no
знаю.
load
Меня просто
screens and
вызвали
super
говорить.
fast
Да,
streaming
я
to
умный.
become a reality. Having said that, expandability of our
Ты не
SSD
сказал
is
per second.
quite important.
Per
Flash is
second.
costly, and you may very well want to add storage to whatever we put in
GBPS.
Now, the kind of storage you need depends on how you're going to use it. If you have an extensive PlayStation 4
Подожди.
library and you'd like to
А,
take advantage
PlayStation
of
4?
backwards compatibility to play those games on PlayStation 5,
Я
then
не
a
понял, только
large
один
external
SSD-шник
hard
будет
drive is
стоять в
ideal.
PS5?
You
Тихо.
can leave your games on the hard drive and play them directly from there, thus saving the pricier SSD storage for your PlayStation 5 titles, or you can copy your active PlayStation 4 titles to the SSD. If your purpose in adding more storage is to play PlayStation 5 titles, though, ideally you would add to your SSD storage. We will be supporting certain
Я не могу,
M2
это такой голос
SSDs.
приятный,
These are
ангелы есть.
internal drives that you can get on the open market
Нет,
and
это
install in a
неприятный.
bay in the PlayStation
Мне
5.
нравится.
As for which ones we support and when, I'll get to that in a moment.
Обычный голос.
They connect through
Да.
the custom I/O unit, just like our
Нет, ну
SSD
такой
does.
типа,
So
ну
they can
такой,
take
ну,
full advantage of
не
the
знаю.
decompression.
Не, Мы с Захаром не поддаемся на психологическое давление.
Не, ну
Here's the
мягенький
catch,
такой.
though. That commercial drive has to be at
Но как он
least as
заканчивает,
fast
да,
as ours.
конечно, классно.
Games that rely on
Here's
the
the
speed of
catch,
our
though.
SSD need to work flawlessly with any M2 drive. When I gave the Wired interview last year, I said that the PlayStation 5 SSD was faster than anything available on PC. At the time, commercial M2 drives used PCIe 3.0, and 4 lanes of that cap out at 3.5 gigabytes a second. In other words, no
ПКшники соснули.
PCIe 3.0 drive can hit the required spec. M2 drives with PCIe 4.0 are now out in the market. We're getting our samples and seeing 4 or 5 gigabytes.
Ха-ха, нет.
By year's end,
Сосочки
I
соснули.
expect there will be drives that saturate 4.0 and support 7
Сорян.
gigabytes a second. Having said that,
Ладно.
we are comparing apples and oranges, though, because that commercial
Apples.
M2 drive will have its own architecture, its own flash controller, and so on. For example, the NVMe specification lays out a priority scheme for requests that the M2 drives can use. And that scheme is pretty nice, but it only has
Там парень
two
ковыряется в
true
носу.
priority levels.
Да,
Large
слева.
numbers
Какой
support
именно?
6.
Слева
We can
лысый.
hook up a drive
Да.
with only two
Он не
priority
лысый.
levels,
Он
definitely,
лысый.
but our custom
Нет.
I/O unit has to
Нет.
arbitrate the extra priorities
Ты в каком
rather than
качестве
the M2
смотришь?
drive's flash controller, and so the M2 drive needs a little extra speed to
Кстати, я
take
в
care of
каком?
issues arising from the different approach. That
Блин,
commercial
могли
drive
бы качество
also needs to
получше завести,
physically
чем
fit
1080.
inside of the bay we created in PlayStation 5.
Ага.
А ты бы увидел
Зачем?
лучше.
Unlike internal hard
Да.
drives,
Так,
there's
зачем тебе?
unfortunately no standard for the height of an M2 drive, and some M2 drives
Парень
have
фермер.
giant heat sinks. In fact, some of them even have their own fans. Right now, we're getting M2 drive samples and benchmarking them in various ways. When games hit beta as they get ready for the
Когда он уже
PlayStation 5
вейпить
launch
будет,
at
что он
year-end,
такие
we'll also be
делаешь?
doing some
Ладно, шутка
compatibility
хуёвая.
testing to make sure that
Ну
the
и всё, он
architecture
переключает
of
презентацию.
particular
Да
M2
шутка
drives
хуёвая, я
isn't
же
too
сказал
foreign for
сразу.
the games to
А,
handle. Once we've done that compatibility testing, we should be able to start letting you know which drives will physically fit and which drive samples have benchmarked appropriately high in our testing.
Не,
It would
Захар, у
be
нас
great
такой
if that happened
залупы
by
не
launch,
будет.
but it's likely to be a bit past it.
какой?
So please hold off on getting
Экраны,
that M2 drive until
переключатели.
you hear from us. Okay, back to our principles. Balancing evolution and revolution
Ну, в
is the
смысле?
second of them. This was definitely a
Хотя,
recurring
кстати.
theme.
А зачем они нам нужны?
We need
Пафос.
new GPU features and capabilities.
А,
Не,
If we
для
only
кого они
have
это
more
вообще делают?
performance, it's not really a new
ну
generation.
вот для 4 человек.
Many of these
Не, ну в
capabilities
смысле,
result in more performance. and
Елена Валентиновна
part
тоже
of why a
юзает.
PlayStation 5 teraflop is more powerful than a PlayStation 4 teraflop. But we aren't just looking for the performance. We also need the ability to do something with the GPU
Может будет, а
that
может
could
нет.
not have been
Может мы
done
не
alone.
захотим с собой деньги на эту хуйню
We
тратить.
need higher performance per watt. Every time we double the performance of some
It's revolution,
GPU
Johnny.
component, we don't want to find out we've doubled the power consumed and the heat produced. But at the same time, we have to make sure the GPU can run PS4 games, and we have to ensure
Я
that the
хочу лично
architecture is
увидеть
easy
только
for the
дизайн.
developers to adopt. Now,
Типа
backwards
и так понятно,
compatibility
что
was
оно будет
handled
быстрее.
masterfully by AMD. They treated it as a key need throughout the design process.
А если
As a
цену скажешь,
solution to
вообще
adding
будет
new
шикарно.
features without blindsiding developers, we made sure that
Мы
if
просто
there were
20%
new
ФНДС
significant
накинем, а
features,
всё.
it would be optional to use them. The GPU supports ray
Ты видел
tracing. You
сегодня
don't
курс,
have to
нет?
use ray tracing to make your game.
Ну вот
The
какая разница,
GPU
процент-то
supports
не
primitive
меняется.
shaders, but you can release your
Ну
first
да,
game
но
on
пиздец.
PlayStation 5 without making any use of
А
it.
это нормально, на
Before I
30%
get into
доллар
the capabilities
вырос,
of
ну
the
что тут
GPU,
такого?
I'd like to make clear 2 points that can be quite confusing. First, we have a custom AMD GPU based on their RDNA 2
AMD.
technology. What does that mean? AMD is continuously improving and revising their tech. For RDNA 2, their goals were, roughly speaking, to reduce power consumption by re-architecting the GPU to put data close to where it's needed, to optimize the GPU for performance, and to add a new, more advanced feature set. But that feature set is malleable, which is to say that we have our own needs for PlayStation, and that can factor into what the AMD roadmap becomes. So collaboration is born. If we bring concepts to AMD that are felt to be widely useful, then they can be adopted into RDNA 2 and used broadly, including in PC GPUs.
Подожди,
If
он
the
сначала
ideas
говорит
are
про процессор,
sufficiently
потом
specific
про
to what
видеокарту,
we're
наверное,
trying to
будет, да?
accomplish, like the GPU cache scrubbers I was talking
То есть
about,
это я еще
then they
успею
end up
сходить
being
покурить и
just
даже дизайн не покажут.
If you see a similar discrete
Да,
GPU
забей они тут.
available as a PC card
Они
at
сейчас
roughly
спеках
the
будут
same time
говорить.
as we release our console, that means our collaboration
Они,
with
походу,
AMD
превратились в Xbox.
succeeded.
Не,
Even though
Xbox такие с
technology
двух
is
ног вырываются,
result
игры
well,
показывают, типа
it
все
doesn't mean that
четко.
we as Sony simply incorporated the PC part into our console.
Хоть мы и не любим
This
Xbox.
continuous improvement in AMD technology means it's dangerous to rely on teraflops as an absolute indicator of performance, and CU count should be avoided as well.
Мне,
In the case of CPUs,
Чё?
we all understand this. The
Мне
PlayStation 4 and
мне
PlayStation 5
непонятна
each have 8 CPUs, but we
формула
never
на
think that
доске.
the capabilities and performance are equal. It's the same for CUs. For one thing, they've been getting much larger over time. Adding new features means adding lots of transistors. In fact, the transistor count for a PlayStation 5 CU is 62% larger than the transistor count for a PlayStation 4 CU. Second, the PlayStation 5 GPU is backwards compatible with PlayStation 4.
Ну, 64% больше приколов, вы слышите?
One way you can achieve backwards compatibility
Транзисторов
is
больше.
to put the previous console's
Ой,
chipset
смотрите,
in the
какую
new
древнюю
console,
хуйню
like we did
вспомнили.
with some PlayStation 3s. But that's, of course, extremely expensive.
Ой, там сейчас будет
A
там
better way
PlayStation
is
5
to
просто как...
incorporate any differences in the previous console's logic into the new console's custom chips, meaning that even as the technology evolves, the logic and feature set that PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 4 Pro titles rely on is still available in backwards compatibility modes. One advantage of this strategy is that once backwards compatibility is in the console, it's in. It's not as if a cost to
я понял.
remove backwards compatibility like it did on PlayStation 3. Achieving this unification of functionality took years of efforts by AMD, as any roadmap advancement creates a potential divergence in logic. Running PS4 and PS4 titles at boosted frequencies has also added complexity.
Некоторые игры,
The
то
boost is
есть, которые будут
truly
на
massive this time
PlayStation
around,
5
and some
выходить,
game
они
code
будут на
just can't
PS4,
handle
по идее,
it.
доступны.
Testing has to be done on a title by
И
title.
Но не
наоборот.
факт. Типа, я думаю, не
Results
все.
are excellent, though. We
Там,
recently
типа, было
took
написано,
Эксклюзивы не будут точно.
PlayStation 4 titles as
Типа, это как
roadblocks
разработчик,
this time,
типа,
and we're
решил.
expecting almost all of them to be playable at
Не,
Кроме
ну, прошку еще,
эксклюзивов.
еще долго можно, я думаю, использовать.
With regards to new features, as I said, our strategy was to try to break new ground, but at the same time
Wow,
not
new
to
geometry
require
engine.
use of the new GPU capabilities. For more than a decade, GPUs have imposed a restriction on game engines.
Нет, да,
Software
нет.
handles vertex processing, but for the most part, dedicated hardware is responsible for the geometry that the vertices form. That means it's not possible to do even basic optimizations, such as aborting processing of a vertex if all geometry that uses it is off-screen. PlayStation 5 has a new unit called the Geometry Engine, which brings handling of triangles and other primitives under full programmatic control. As a game developer, you're free to ignore its existence and use the PlayStation 5 GPU as if it were no more capable than the PS4 GPU, or you can use this new intelligence in various ways. Simple usage could be performance optimization, such as removing backfaced or off-screen vertices and triangles. More complex usage involves something called primitive shaders, which allow the game to synthesize geometry on the fly as it's being rendered. It's a brand new capability. Using primitive shaders on PlayStation 5 will allow for a broad variety of techniques, including smoothly varying level of detail, addition of procedural detail to close-up objects, and improvements to particle effects and other visual special effects. Another major new feature of our custom RDNA 2-based GPU is ray tracing, using the same strategy as AMD's upcoming PC GPUs. The CUs contain a new specialized unit called the intersection engine, which can calculate the intersection of rays with boxes and triangles. To use the intersection engine, first you build what is called an acceleration structure. It's data in RAM that contains all of your geometry. There's a specific set of formats you can use. They're variations on the same BVH concept. Then, in your shader program, you use a new instruction that asks the intersection
Артём, будешь
engine to
покупать?
check a ray against the BVH.
Я не знаю.
While the intersection engine is processing the requested ray triangle or ray box
Откуда у меня
intersection,
деньги
the
лол?
shaders
Сколько
are
он будет?
free
На
to
1000
do
баксов
whatever
будет
you want.
стоить?
Having said that, the ray
Но-
tracing instruction is
Примерно.
pretty memory intensive, so it's
Ну,
a
оно
good
не
bet
Ну, не
against
1000,
logic
нет.
heavy code.
Я видел где-то
There's
700.
of course no need to use ray tracing. PS4 graphics
Ну,
engines
700,
will run
600.
just fine on
700 с
PlayStation
таким
5,
курсом доллара?
but it
Спасибо.
presents an opportunity for those
Да,
interested.
есть
I'm
такое.
thinking
Спасибо,
it'll
не
take
надо.
Там,
less
знаешь,
than a
типа
million
ради
frames a second to have a big
Cyberpunk,
impact on
например.
audio. That should be enough
Ага.
for audio occlusion
Класс.
and some reverb calculations. With a bit more of the GPU invested in ray tracing, it should be possible to do some very nice
Чё там
global
еще?
illumination.
Мгм.
Having
Что там
said
еще-то?
that, adding ray-traced shadows
Ну, из
and
пока
reflections to a traditional graphics engine could easily
заанонсенных
take
ничего.
hundreds of millions of rays a second, and full
А,
ray
ну,
tracing could take
Ой,
в принципе,
неправда.
всех
How far can we
эксклюзивов.
go? I'm starting to get quite bullish. I've already seen a
PlayStation
PlayStation 5 title
4 и
that's
5.
successfully using ray tracing-based reflections in complex animated scenes with
Йо.
only modest costs. Another set of issues for the GPU
Что, можно встать,
involve
лол?
size
А, я
and
сдох.
frequency. How big do we make the
Понял,
GPU,
извините.
and what frequency do we run?
Погоди, ты во
This is a
что?
balancing act. The chip has a cost, and there's a cost for whatever we
понял.
use to supply that chip with
Я
power
думал, ты
and to
смотришь.
cool it. In general,
Я
I
вот
like
игры.
running the GPU at higher frequency. Let me show you.
Не, я смотрю.
Here's
Я
two
ждал монитор,
possible
лол.
configurations for a GPU roughly of the level of the PlayStation 4 Pro. This is a thought experiment. Don't take these configurations too seriously. If you just calculate teraflops, you get the same number. But actually, the performance is noticeably different because teraflops is defined as the computational capability of the vector ALU. That's just one part of the GPU. There are a lot of other units. And those other units all run faster when the GPU frequency is higher. At 33% higher frequency, rasterization goes 33% faster. Processing the command buffer goes that much faster. The L2 and other caches have that much higher bandwidth, and so on. About the only downside is that system memory is 33% further away in terms of cycles. But the large number of benefits more than counterbalance that. As a friend of mine says, a rising tide lifts all boats. Also, it's easier to fully use 36 CUs in parallel than it is to
как
fully
сказал мой
use
друг, я
48
ничего не понял.
CUs. When triangles are small, it's
Очень
much harder to
интересно.
fill all those CUs with useful work.
Вообще
So
нихуя не
there's a
понятно,
lot to be
но
said for
очень
faster,
интересно.
assuming you can handle the resulting power and heat issues, which frankly, we haven't always done the best job at. Part of the reason for that is, historically, our process for setting CPU and GPU frequencies has relied on some heavy-duty guesswork with regards to how much electrical power games will consume and how much heat will be produced as a result inside of the console.
Че?
Power consumption varies a lot from game to game. When I
Не
play God of War on my PS4 Pro, I know the power consumption is high just by the fan noise. But power isn't simply about engine quality. It's about the minutia of what's being displayed now. It's counterintuitive, but processing dense geometry typically consumes less power than processing simple geometry, which is, I suspect, why Horizon's map screen, with its low triangle count, makes my PS4 Pro heat up so much. Our process on previous consoles has been to try to guess what the maximum power consumption during the entire console lifetime might be, which is to say, the worst case scene in the worst case game, and prepare a cooling solution that we think will be quiet at that power level. If we get it right, fan noise is minimal. If we get it wrong, the console will be quite loud for the higher power. And there's even a chance that it might overheat and shut
Не
down
сильно,
if we
конечно.
misestimate power too badly. PlayStation 5 is
Ой, так, то есть
especially
я
challenging.
Когда я
ничего не
показывал, я
пропустил, да?
и пока
56-bit
Ну
native
да.
instructions that consume a lot of power.
А чего не
Those are
про
great
топор
here and
втирает?
there, but presumably only
Типа
minimal
тише будет.
Or are they?
Топор?
If we plan for major 256
Нет, топор это God of
instruction
War.
usage, we need to set the CPU clock substantially lower or noticeably increase the size of the power supply and fan. So,
Понятно,
after
себе
much
подвиг
discussion,
игрок.
we decided to go with a very different direction on PlayStation 5. We built a GPU with 36
Ага, очень
CUs.
интересно.
Mind you, RDNA 2
Блядь.
CUs are large, each with 62% more transistors than the CUs we were using on PlayStation 4.
Пацан, ЦПшник
So,
будет
if we
побольше.
compare transistor counts,
Вы видели,
36
что там Бодов
RDNA 2
скинул?
CUs equates to roughly
Не.
58
Вот
PlayStation
здесь
4
я просто
CUs.
смотрю на
It
это
is a
превью, и
fairly
мне стало
sizable
смешно.
GPU. Then we went with a variable
Шпильмулька.
frequency strategy for PlayStation 5,
Понял.
which is to say we continuously run the GPU and CPU in boost mode. We supply
Wow,
a
boost
generous
mode.
amount of electrical power and then increase the frequency of GPU and CPU until they reach the capabilities of the system's cooling solution. It's a completely different paradigm. Rather than running at constant frequency and letting power vary based on the workload, we run at essentially constant power and let the frequency
Знаете, у меня стоит
vary based on
1080, но при этом...
Мыло.
We then
Мыло.
tackled the
Я ж
engineering
говорю.
challenge of a
Ну-ка,
cost
я еще
effective
1080 раз
high-performance
нажму.
cooling
Нет,
solution
ничего
И ничего не
designed for
изменилось.
that specific power
Да.
level. In some ways, it becomes a simpler problem because there are no more unknowns. There's no need to guess what power consumption the worst-case game might have. As for the details of the cooling solution, we're saving them for our teardown. I think you'll be quite happy with what the engineering team came up with. So, how fast can we run the GPU and CPU with this strategy? The simplest approach would be to look at the actual temperature of the silicon die and throttle the frequency on that basis. But that won't work. It fails to create a consistent PlayStation 5 experience. It wouldn't do to run the console slower simply because it was in a hot room. So rather than look at the actual temperature of the silicon die, we look at the activities that the GPU and CPU are performing
Господи,
and set the
парни,
frequencies
зачем надо
on
это
that
рассказывать?
basis. which makes everything
А
А вообще там говорили, что будут про архитектуру
While at
говорить.
it, we also used
Да?
AMD's
Да.
smart shift
Понятно.
technology
Ты мне
and
сказал то,
sent
что это
any
будет, блин,
unused power
анонс.
from the CPU
Ой, не
to the
анонс, а
GPU,
релиз. Ой.
so it can squeeze out
Нет,
a
что-то
few
мне там
more
говорил другое.
pixels. The benefits of
Сказал, блин,
this
PlayStation 5, я
strategy
такой,
are
все, понял.
quite large.
Ну,
Running
это
a
PlayStation
GPU
5,
at 2
да.
gigahertz was looking at a reachable target with the old fixed frequency